Welcome. My name is Chris Novak, and I am the Global Director of the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center, or also referred to as the VTRAC. For folks who are not familiar with the VTRAC or what I do here, I oversee this part of the organization that specifically focuses on helping customers with things like digital forensics, breach investigations, incident response, and threat intelligence. And we do this on a global basis for organizations of all shapes, sizes, and industries. And what we're here to talk about today is cybersecurity, past, present, and future. So in other words, what is it that we've historically seen? How do we see it today? And what do we expect to see kind of changing and evolving for the future? And one of the things that I think is important when you look at the context of that is the perspective that Verizon has into this evolving landscape. In particular here, you kind of see the global map of all of our data connection lines and such there on the right-hand side. And, people will think of us as the telco or a wireless provider or an ISP. And, all of that is interesting. Obviously, I look at us as also a big security player. But one of the things that's really interesting from that perspective is the fact that as an ISP, as a wireless provider, as a telco, we manage and operate a significant portion of the internet backbone, essentially the battleground in which cyber attacks take place. And so when a threat actor decides to target a victim or go through an intermediary, that traffic has to go across a network. And that network in many cases may be one that we manage and operate. And so we have visibility into some of those movements as we're helping customers manage through attacks or incidents that may be happening at that time. And we have the ability to then analyze that traffic pattern and see whether or not there are other interesting data points, threat intelligence, IOCs, or otherwise just general context, as well as potentially even being able to identify other collateral victims of the same threat actor or threat actor group. And so I wanted to kind of just add that perspective because it's more than just going out there and doing breach investigations. It's also understanding what that broader landscape looks like and how we may be able to utilize that to help from a cyber defense posture. So you see here so much to discuss. This just gives you a glimpse into the various different thought leadership publications that we have released over the course of the years. Obviously, you see there the data breach investigations report on the left-hand side, and then moving across to the right, we have released a separate report that just kind of gives you a glimpse into the insider threat perspective on things. The Mobile Security Index, which focuses more specifically on things like mobile, wireless, and so on. And then you have the Payment Security Report, which is much more financially focused and also has a very specific view into things like PCI and PFI matters. And then you have the Protected Health Information Breach Report, which is very specific to the healthcare industry, largely put together because we found that there was a significant amount of both interest, questions, concerns, and activity happening in the healthcare sector with respect to data privacy, data security, and unfortunately also data breaches. And then on the far right-hand side, the Data Breach Digest, which kind of is a more scenario, case study, story-based driven report about what it's kind of like to be in the midst of a breach investigation and looking at it through a variety of different perspectives of, anywhere from incident commander to HR to legal to victims and so on. For the purposes of today, we're really just going to focus on the left-hand report there, the Data Breach Investigations Report, because I think that gives us right now the best perspective on that past, present, and future view. If you'd like to take a look at the other reports, they are all freely available on VerizonEnterprise.com, and I welcome you to take a look at those. For the purposes of this, the Data Breach Investigations Report, or we refer to sometimes as the DBIR, is now in its 12th year of publication. So this isn't something that we're new at. This is actually something we've been doing for quite some time, and I think it's interesting to point out that it is also not just Verizon's view. You see there that there are 73 contributors in total that help us put this report together, and part of the reason that we do that, it's very intentional, is we don't want there to be bias in the report, or at least we want to remove as much bias as we can by getting other organizations to contribute their data and their analytics and their perspective on what the landscape looks like from different angles. That way, if Verizon's view on things looks like one thing, someone else can balance it out with views from other angles, other industries, other geographies, and so on. So for example, you also see that it is fairly well representative of the globe. Obviously, it doesn't touch every single country all the time, and this kind of changes shapes and colors over the course of years based on the data that we have. But you see there, the data corpus is significant. Just in the last year, we're looking at 41,686 security incidents, and over 2,000 data breaches make up this year's report. If you actually look at the universe of data that we have going back to the first report, we're well into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So it's a pretty significant data set to encompass. And again, the key piece here is to build a good cross-sectional view of what that landscape looks like, because our goal here is to provide education, awareness, and information with the intent that readers of this report can actually use this to drive their security initiatives, right? They can say, hey, if this is what the landscape looks like, and these are where organizations are struggling, or this is how breaches are happening, then these are the things that I want to focus on from a risk-based approach when I implement new security controls or when I develop a strategic security roadmap or plan for my organization. So as we kind of jump in here, a couple of things I'll kind of be pointing out as we walk through. In particular, I talked about our threat intelligence. When we started looking at the data breach information that we gathered, over 10 years ago when we first started publishing this, one of the biggest challenges we had was we had so much data on breaches that it was almost hard to figure out what to talk about and how to categorize it. And so we actually borrowed from a bit of biology research in terms of the data science side of it and looked at how scientists analyze things like DNA. And then we used a similar strategy to say, how do we look at breaches, kind of incidents like almost like diseases or DNA? How do we kind of decompile it or disassemble it and then try to put it into categories or genres? And so back in 2014, when we looked at that, we started building out for the first time what we call our incident classification patterns. And you see the charts on the right-hand side show those patterns in name. And you see the incident patterns on the left-hand chart and the breach patterns on the right-hand chart. And it's probably worth mentioning the difference between incidents and breaches for our definitions. When we refer to incidents, we refer to essentially something that, trips an alarm and requires some kind of review or investigation. Whereas when we look at the other hand side and see breaches, these are situations where after having performed some level of investigation, we've actually confirmed that there was an exposure or an impact to the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of some form of sensitive or valuable data. And so it's interesting when you look at these, how there's kind of a different makeup of what hits the top of the chart for both incidents and breaches. For example, you see privilege misuse being the biggest thing that we see on the incident side, whereas when you actually delve into where the data losses are most often happening when we actually perform the breach investigations, you see that web applications actually top the chart. So you can kind of look at it in one way of, the people elements of it are resulting in a fair number of incidents in terms of privilege misuse, but where the data is actually probably most often leaking is on the web application side of things. And then obviously you can go on down the charts from there, denial of service, crimeware, and so on down the list. What's also interesting is when you look at this, you'll see 98.5% of the security incidents and 88% of the confirmed breaches continue to fall into these categories still to this day, despite the fact we built this framework or these patterns 5 years ago. So I think it's kind of interesting to see the consistency that that's had over time, which tells us that I think we did a pretty good job back in 2014 in initially developing these patterns. And obviously that's something we continue to monitor each year to see whether or not changes in threat attack patterns or threat actor movements would warrant us changing or reclassifying anything. So the next thing that we found really interesting in this year's report was kind of an evolution in terms of who was being targeted. In particular, we saw a significant movement towards targeting of C-level executives. So whereas in the past, we kind of saw it maybe a bit more spread out. In this case, more recently, we've seen that the senior executives are 12 times more likely to be the target of social incidents, that being social engineering attacks, phishing, pretexting, things along those lines. And they were 9 times more likely to be the target of social breaches than in previous years. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that so much of what we see in the breach landscape is financially motivated. You see there on the chart to the right-hand side, financial motivation kind of being the top of it. And that's, I think, a lot, kind of mirroring or aligning with traditional crime. The majority of crime that most of us probably see or hear about in our daily lives is usually motivated by some criminal that is trying to do something in order to achieve or obtain or maintain a financial interest. And so that is a big driving factor of what we see here. And I think a big piece of why we see the C-levels targeted is because they generally have influence, they generally have authority, they generally have the ability to make major decisions or have access to very sensitive information. And we've seen the dynamics of that play out almost into a kind of a whole different scenario of types of breaches that we'll talk about in a little while. Here you see a little bit of a shift in terms of the attacker behavior towards more cloud-based services. Now, I want to be really careful about how I say this, in that I don't want to say that cloud-based anything is more risky or more problematic or more susceptible to breaches, but more that, and not because of cloud itself, but what I want to really dive into is the fact that what we're seeing on the cloud side is, misconfigurations, social engineering attacks that allow someone to gain remote access to it. A lot of times we see this around things like cloud-based email accounts where the organization is not hosting and managing their own email anymore. And as a result, if someone gets a phishing or pretexting attack that results in their password being compromised, if, for example, they're not using multi-factor authentication, that threat actor has the ability to gain access now to their email platform. And, I ask people this: how many people, if you were to walk up to a stranger, would you just be willing to give them access to your email inbox? I think pretty much uniformly everybody would say no. They would never be willing to do it. And it's because so much of your life happens on email. There's a lot of probably personal or corporate or sensitive information that is transacted in email these days. And so that's also why threat actors are finding it to be an interesting target of their objectives, because there's so much that they can do or use from that to enrich themselves. And a lot of that is happening here, as you see on the right-hand side, based on the use of stolen credentials. Now, here's an example of a financially motivated social engineering attack, kind of a scenario that we see playing out very commonly today and more often. And this is a situation where you see kind of the threat actor on the top left-hand side of the screen there. They go ahead and they send a phishing or a pretexting or some kind of message to a potential victim. You see there, John just made up a company at abc.company.com, for example, and they send this phishing email to John, and they try to get John to give up his credentials. And so they send him this email basically saying, hey, there is a late payment. We need you to go to this link. We need you to process this. And so what does John, the accountant, do? He goes to the website, he logs in, and actually, interestingly enough, in this particular example, the threat actor was pretty savvy. They said, go ahead and log in with whatever email password you have. We accept all of them. Basically trying to get whoever they sent the phishing email to log in with their actual legitimate email password. But what ultimately happened is they were going to a fake site. That fake site then captured that email password, and now the threat actor had John, the accountant's email password. So now the threat actor goes, logs into John's email with that, and starts reading all of John's emails. Now, these are all his corporate emails. So as he's reading those emails, the threat actor is learning how this particular company operates. Particularly, John, the accountant, has specific access over things like moving money, making transfers, wire transfers, things like that. And what the threat actor becomes very aware of is they learn the process for how those kinds of activities are done within this company. And so from there, what the threat actor does is they go out for about $5 and goes and buys a fake website domain and email domain that looks a lot like John's company. So if you look at the left-hand side, you'll see John's company will say john@abc.company.com. Well, the threat actor went out and bought abc-company.com. So unless you're paying really close attention, you probably didn't even notice that it was the wrong domain, right? And I'm sure many of us have seen things like this happen, but keep in mind, not everybody who receives these phishing emails are extraordinarily technical, and so may not be aware of these nuances. And so using that domain, the threat actor then goes ahead and creates a fake email address called cfo@abc-company.com. So now it looks like we have a CFO email address at the company. So now the threat actor says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and create some fake invoices. And so the threat actor goes and, using the access he has to John's real corporate email, he goes ahead, takes some of the actual invoices, changes them up a little bit, and you see here he creates two invoices, one for $395,000 and one for $774,000. And he goes ahead and creates them. And actually what's interesting is during the forensic analysis, what we actually find is the threat actor simply went on the internet. You can even see the website there. And there's a free website that the threat actor was able to go onto, take the existing invoices he found in John's email box, edit them using an online PDF editor, create new fake invoices, and then send them on to their fake CFO email account. So think about it this way. The normal process this company would go through is they would have the invoices would come in to the CFO. The CFO would have to approve them. And then once the CFO approved them, they would go ahead and get submitted for payment. And so in this case, the threat actor then sent the fake invoices to the fake CFO. And now the fake CFO, of course, sends back an approval message. So now everyone believes it's approved because they looked at the email and it looks like it's a legitimate email. Again, taking into consideration, it's got the hyphen and not the period. And then they go ahead and take that fake CFO email, send it to the wire transfer department, who then goes ahead and moves $1.2 million. This whole process only took 7 days worth of work on the part of the threat actor, but they walked away with $1.2 million. And all it cost them was the cost of setting up that email domain, an email account, and writing a few emails, and that was it. And so we see a lot more of these kinds of things happening. Now, it's interesting, we kind of looked at kind of a little bit about who the threat actors were and how they're doing it, but I'd like to dive a little bit more deeply into the who. In particular, you see here, we see organized crime, state-affiliated, system admins, activists, and you even see a little bit of cashiers in there, but that's really largely died off. The big ones that we see today on the far right-hand side is largely dominated by organized crime groups and state-affiliated. And then we also see a significant rise from 2016 to 2018 of almost up to 20% or so on the system admin side, so internal people. And it's interesting when you look at this because you see that miscellaneous errors account for almost 21% of breaches. So this means that it's not even necessarily a bad actor having to work all that hard to get access to the data. It may simply be someone on the inside that just misconfigured something. And in fact, when you look at it, you see about 60+ million records were impacted or disclosed just purely due to misconfiguration. So there's a lot that organizations can obviously still be doing from a kind of checks and balances perspective on their overall security and controls. Obviously, when we look at the organized crime and the state affiliated, you kind of have different motivating factors behind those, which we'll dig into in a little bit more detail. So when I talk about threat actor motivation, you see there, this is the chart we actually showed before as well. You see financially motivated attacks make up the large percentage of it, with espionage kind of coming in second, and then other being, a variety of other things from activists to other motivating factors. But it's interesting, you see there about a quarter of all breaches are still associated with espionage, and espionage typically being associated with trying to gain access to things like trade secrets and intellectual property. It's, it's sensitive data, generally data that's of extremely high value, maybe in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. but oftentimes it's valuable to a very small subset of individuals or organizations, and a lot of times it may be nation state affiliated or a state actor involved. Whereas when we look at the financially motivated, the majority of those are more actually opportunistic. Whereas the espionage attacks are usually very targeted at an individual or organization based on who they are, what they do, or their specific data. The financially motivated attacks are generally more, the threat actors just casting a wide net and seeing who they catch. They don't necessarily care as long as they gain access to some kind of data that they can obtain and then sell on the darknet. That's generally what they're after. They don't necessarily care who the victim is, and in many cases they're very kind of non-discriminating in that they hit organizations large and small with these kinds of attacks. So it's kind of interesting to look at how they actually pursue those motivators. So when we look at the source of the threat actors, you see here kind of the breakdown of external, internal, and partner. Partner, single digits, so not huge, but it presents kind of that unique attack vector because it can be more difficult to detect. It's someone that you kind of quasi-trust, or you've given access to information or resources or systems. And so sometimes it may be a little bit harder to distinguish that activity if something were to kind of go rogue. External, though, you see still making up the large majority of what we see happening in these incidents, where you see insiders making up about 34% or so. A lot of the reason we really find that the insiders manage to get away with what they do is because a lot of organizations still today do not have really adequate insider threat programs, if having a program at all. And the reason why I point that out is kind of like what I mentioned earlier around the partner side of things. It can be difficult to detect. Insider activity also is extremely difficult to detect because, if you think about it, someone whose day-to-day job it is to handle sensitive information is going to be handling sensitive information. So you can't use the same kind of monitoring that you would use, say, to catch an external actor who you'd say, hey, they should never have access to this kind of data, versus an internal person who normally would. You almost have to really look at it more behaviorally. You have to look and see what is normal and what is abnormal. When do things move outside of the traditional bounds, or when is it that inside resource is doing something that looks very different than what they've done before, and therefore you may need to dig a little bit deeper into it. Another thing here that's kind of an interesting perspective on it is, what we call the unbroken chains and kind of path-based attack analysis. When we looked at the data, and this is actually kind of a new thing that we dove into in the last year of analysis of our data breach information, and that is the number of steps it actually took to successfully compromise the victim. And it's interesting in that when you look at the chart on the left-hand side, you'll see that the number of breaches is extraordinarily high when the number of steps is extraordinarily low. And, that probably is common sense. And ultimately what we're trying to demonstrate here is that most of these breaches didn't take a lot of steps to actually occur. The data may have been close to the perimeter, or there may not have been many controls or stopgaps or layers of security between the threat actor and the underlying data that they were looking to get access to and their ability to exfiltrate it. And so I think this helps to demonstrate the importance of having layers of security or defense in depth strategies where we say, how is it that we have a number of different mechanisms to be able to create roadblocks or speed bumps in the process? Because the threat actors, they're people. They don't want to take any extra effort than they absolutely have to in order to accomplish their objective. And if they perceive the effort required to be significantly difficult, we've seen them move on. We've seen them say, hey, I've given this a shot. I'm not in. I'm moving on to the next one. There are millions, if not billions, of targets out there on the internet for them to go after. So why make that any more difficult than they need to? And so you'll see here in terms of looking at those number of steps, as the number of steps increase, the number of successful breaches has dramatically decreased. So again, I would very much encourage organizations to look at their layered approach or their defense in-depth strategy in terms of how they would typically deal with incidents on a regular basis. And then kind of as we kind of start drawing to a conclusion here, where do we go from here as we look towards the future? There's a lot of different conclusions we can draw and recommendations that we can make. Here's kind of a handful, I think, of the ones that are probably most salient for this conversation. And, you know, understand and learn from historical threats and breaches. I think this one is important, and really the whole genesis of why we created the Data Breach Investigations Report is to be able to give people a view into it. Because a lot of times organizations sometimes struggle to have that wider view in terms of actually looking beyond their own organizations. I see this a lot when I talk to different people and find that their view of the threat landscape is based on what they can see with their own instrumentation. And I always am trying to encourage people to talk to others, get plugged into outside groups, read and learn about what's happening in the world around you, because there may be threats and risks and other kinds of incidents happening all around the globe that you can try to learn from and implement controls in your own organization, such that if that threat actor starts moving across and hits you next, or hits you a month from now, you at least have implemented some of those controls that may be able to better defend or detect against that. The other thing I'd also highlight here is combining risk and threat modeling with past and present trends. It can't just be about blocking and tackling by just throwing lots of controls or lots of money at a problem. It needs to have a real risk-based approach. Anybody who knows security knows that you can always spend more, you can always do more, you can always hire more. But more isn't always necessarily better if you're not making efficient, strategic use of all of those resources, no matter what they may be. In fact, I've seen some organizations go from under-instrumentation of their environment to over-instrumentation in terms of the pendulum swinging all the way in the other direction. They went from having almost no visibility to then going, great, we're going to buy everything, and now they have so many bells and whistles and alarms going off, they have trouble trying to keep up with it and figuring out what's real and what's a false positive. And so you could literally have your engineers and analysts going off chasing all sorts of false positives, and you're not necessarily helping yourself there either. Avoiding assumptions. Things change fast and are not always as they may seem. I see a lot of this, especially sometimes when organizations don't have reliable sources of information to draw on. And so as a result, they may be making poor security decisions based on relatively low confidence or low fidelity data. I would generally encourage organizations to really plug into that external security partner ecosystem, you know, plugging into others who are actually out there living it and seeing it and trying to understand the confidence that exists in the data that they have access to. Building flexibility into the people, process, and technology. Adaptability is key. This is critical. You know, obviously, I think any security professional recognizes that the landscape is constantly evolving and changing. The threat actors don't just lather, rinse, repeat. They are changing their tactics. And when something stops working, they modify it. And so we need to make sure that we are trying to do the same thing with our people, processes, and technology. We need to make sure that our people are not getting stagnant. We're getting out there and getting them to training. We're getting them plugged into different kinds of exercises and tabletops and breach simulations. You know, anything that we can do to immerse them in an understanding of what that new landscape looks like is helpful to them in being able to protect, detect, respond, recover, and so on through potential incidents. And then last but not least, plan, practice, and prepare for new threats and risks. You know, what is it that organizations are doing in this regard? And this also includes things like policies and procedures. I know sometimes a lot of folks are not excited by policies and procedures and playbooks and run books, but the reality of it is if we don't have solid policies and procedures, the people who actually have to execute when an incident happens, they don't necessarily have some strong foundation to rely on. Or worse, you may have conflict, infighting, or politics that can cause your response actions to significantly deviate from what you would otherwise have expected. And so, you know, generally when we're working with a lot of our rapid response retainer customers, we're generally kind of trying to get them on a program or a security strategy journey where we say, let's start with looking at policies and procedures. What do you have? How do we tweak and tune that? Then how do we go through training to make sure that all the people who are supposed to be part of that process, one, they know they should be part of it. 2, they know what's expected, and 3, they know how to respond. And then lastly, we would go through things like tabletop exercises and breach simulations in order to actually see what the outcome and effects of that look like, and then feed that back into the beginning in terms of the policies and the procedures if we need to make changes or augmentation. And then lastly, before we close, I again want to thank everybody for their participation here. Again, I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to check out any of these reports. Like I said, they're all available on VerizonEnterprise.com. I'm also happy to also take offline questions. You see my Twitter and my email there. Feel free to connect with me. I like to try to publish as much as I can on cybersecurity, especially as we're either releasing new information or I find interesting things out there to share with the community.